Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis and Mirz Hashem. Today we'll be learning Daf Nun Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Netillas Yadayim, and we pick up today on the very top line of Nun Amud Aleph with Siman Kuf Nun Tes Sif Vav. So the Mechaber says, Lo Yitein Mayim Lachaveroi B'Chafnav. You cannot pour water onto your friend's hand for Netillas Yadayim purposes using your handfuls of water. So you can't go and scoop up a handful of water, 2 palmfuls of water, and then go and pour it onto your friend's hands for Netillas Yadayim purposes. And the Mechaber says, why is that? Why can't you do this? Says the Mechaber, the reason you can't do this is she'ein noitlim ela min hakli, because one of the halachas that we learned right away at the beginning of the Siman is that Netillas Yadayim has to be done from a keli. Your hands are not a keli. Even though you form your hands into a clay kibble, your hands are not kelim. You're an adam. You're not a keli. And therefore, you can't wash Netillas Yadayim for your friend using your hands. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says over here, in Mishnah Berurah's Kat L'Chav Tes, B'Chafnav. You can't do this with your hands. And says the Mishnah Berurah, Va'afilu hayu yadav taharos. This is true even though your hands may be tahar. The point of the Mishnah Berurah over here is, the Mishnah Berurah is saying, look, you might think that the problem over here is a tumah and tahara problem. Let's take what might seem as a fairly typical case. Somebody comes along and he says, look, I want to eat a tuna fish sandwich, and I don't have a keli, I don't have a way to wash the Netillas Yadayim. So you tell him, okay, I'll help you out. Turn on the faucet, I'll catch water in my hands, and then I'll pour water onto your hands for Netillas Yadayim. Now, in that scenario, we don't need the Mechaber to tell me that that doesn't work. Why? Because ein noitlim ela min hakli. In that case, it doesn't work from a tumah and tahara standpoint. It doesn't work. If your hands are stam yadayim, if your hands are tameh, and you go and you scoop up water in your hands, that water becomes tameh from your hands. Now, when you take that water and you pour it onto your chaver's hands, of course you can't accomplish the Netillas Yadayim. You're trying to accomplish the Netillas Yadayim with water that's not tahar. You're trying to accomplish the Netillas Yadayim with water that's tameh. Of course that doesn't work. The chiddush of the Mechaber over here is like the Mishnah Berurah says, Va'afilu hayu yadav taharos. Even if your hands are tahar. So let's say what happened over here is, somehow you had a keli to go wash the Netillas Yadayim. So you washed the Netillas Yadayim, and now your hands are tahar. And after you washed Netillas Yadayim, you were not misiach das from your hands. You kept your hands tahar from the time that you washed Netillas Yadayim until now. So your hands are tahar. You might think, since my hands are tahar, I can scoop up water in my hands and pour them onto my chaver's hands for the Netillas Yadayim purposes. Why not? My hands are tahar. For that reason, says the Mechaber, in that case, even in that case, where your hands are tahar, you still can't do this. Why? Because the Netillas Yadayim needs a keli, and your hands are not a keli. So again, that's why the Mishnah Berurah says over here in Chav Tes, Va'afilu hayu yadav taharos. Even if your hands are tahar, you still cannot use water scooped up in your hands to wash the Netillas Yadayim for your chaver, because your hands are not a keli. So again, that's why the Mechaber starts off here, Sivav, Lo yitein mayim lechaveri b'chafnav, she'ein noitlim ela min hakli. Okay. Give me 1 second here. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, weiter in the Mechaber. Now, says the Mechaber, second line down, here on Nun Amud Aleph in the Mechaber. For who hadin, same halacha applies, says the Mechaber. Im notol yodoi achas mehakli. Let's say you're washing Netillas Yadayim. So you took the cup in your left hand, and you washed Netillas Yadayim on your right hand. So you have your right hand is now tahar. V'hu adin im notel yodei achas me'akli. If you washed Netillas Yadayim on one hand properly from a keli, and now the shafach mimena, now you have leftover water in your right hand. You washed once mayim rishonim onto your right hand, then you washed mayim shniim, you washed a second time onto your right hand, and now when you finish washing, you have some leftover water in your right hand. So now you want to take the water from your right hand and you want to pour it over onto your left hand for the Netillas Yadayim purposes. Says the Mechaber, you can't do that. If you washed one hand properly from a keli, and now you take the leftover water and you pour it onto your other hand, that doesn't accomplish anything. And what the Mechaber is saying is, he starts off this phrase by saying V'hu hadin. So this is the same halacha as the previous halacha. In the previous halacha we said you can't scoop up water and do Netillas Yadayim for your chaver, even if your hands are tahar. Why? Because the Netillas Yadayim has to be done from a keli. Your hands don't constitute a keli. Says the Mechaber, V'hu hadin. Same halacha applies. You wash the Netillas Yadayim properly on your right hand is now tahar. You want to use the leftover water in your right hand and you want to pour it over onto your left hand, that doesn't accomplish the Netillas Yadayim. Why doesn't it accomplish the Netillas Yadayim? Because the Netillas Yadayim has to be done from a keli, and your right hand is not a keli. Let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Lamed. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'shafach mimena, you poured from your right hand onto your left hand. Hainu, says the Mishnah Berurah, achar shekvar nigmar hanetila miyad achas. This halacha, just like the first halacha, is talking about when you're trying to pour from a hand that is tahar. So when the Mechaber says this second halacha, that the same way you can't pour water from your handful onto your chaver's hand, you also can't pour water from your first hand onto your second hand. It's talking about when the first hand is already tahar. Why is the first hand tahar? Because you already washed the Netillas Yadayim properly on the right hand. If the first hand was tamei, then of course you can't do this. The water that's in the first hand is tamei. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu achar shekvar nigmar hanetila miyad achas. Now shafach me'amayim anishar toich pisas yadai. Now you want to take the water that's left over in the palm of your first hand, ala yad shniya, and you want to pour it over onto the second hand. Lahachi, it's in this case, and because of this, einoi klum deloy ba hanetila me'akli. It's in this case that the reason you don't accomplish the Netillas Yadayim on the second hand by doing this is because it's not coming from a keli. But if your first hand was tamei, because you didn't wash proper Netillas Yadayim on the first hand, then of course it wouldn't work. Not because your hand is not a keli, because the water would be tamei and you can't wash Netillas Yadayim with mayim that's tamei. Now the Mishnah Berurah says an interesting thing. How about this case? V'mehechsik hayadayim zu tachazu. Let's say you place your hands so that one is under the other, right? So you have your two hands here, one is under the other. V'shafach echad, and now somebody comes along to help you do the Netillas Yadayim. And he fills up a keli. V'shafach echad ala yad ha'elyoina, somebody comes and pours water from a keli onto your top hand. Umimena, and from the top hand, Memela nishpach gam al hayad ashniya shetachtea. If I'm holding my hands like this, and somebody comes with a keli, and he pours water onto my top hand, the water is going to flow from my top hand down onto my bottom hand. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, nitara al yedezeh. In that case, it would work. The second hand would become tar. That is called a proper Netillas Yadayim. Ukidlakaman b'siman kuf samach beis sif hey. That works, like we're going to see later on in kuf samach beis sif hey. Why does it work? The netila achashem. Because let's remember, the point of the Mechaber over here is that in these cases, the reason the netila didn't work is because it wasn't done from a keli. So in the two cases that the Mechaber gave us, in the first case, you scooped up water in your hands and you poured it onto your chaver's hands. There's no keli. Since there's no keli, there's no Netillas Yadayim. In the second case, you poured onto your right hand with a keli, and then after you finished Netillas Yadayim on your right hand, and your right hand is tar, you had leftover water in your right hand, you poured it over onto your left hand. There's no keli. You poured it from your hand. You didn't pour it from a keli. In those two cases, you have a problem that there's no keli. But if you position your two hands like this, and somebody comes with a keli and pours onto the top hand, and from the same pour, the water goes onto the top hand and then onto the bottom hand, that works. Why? Because in that case, it's one act of washing. We look at it that both hands were washed together. We don't look at it that the top hand was washed and the top hand poured water onto the second hand, onto the bottom hand. No, it's one act of netila. Water was poured from the keli onto two hands. So in that case, the water did come from a keli, and since the water came from a keli, it's a proper Netillas Yadayim. As far as Tumah and Tahara, this also works. We don't say that the mayim became tummy for the first hand, transferred tumah to the second hand. No, the same way the tumah comes off the first hand with the washing from the keli, the tumah comes off of the second hand with the washing from the keli as well. Okay, that's the Shitas HaMachaber. Now, the last word on the second line in the Shulchan Aruch says the Machaber, V'Rabbeinu Tam Mater Bezu. Rabbeinu Tam says, and we're going to learn right away, like the Pashtus, the simple way to understand this, which is the way the Chavetz Chaim understands it in the Mishnah Beururah. Then we'll take a look at a Bir Halacha where the Chavetz Chaim gives a possible second pshat. But in the Mishnah Beururah, the Chavetz Chaim learns the simple way. He says like this, V'Rabbeinu Tam Mater Bezu. Rabbeinu Tam says that this second case does work. What was the second case? You washed your first hand from a keli properly, and now you pour the water from the first hand onto the second hand. Rabbeinu Tam says that in that case, it is a good Netillas Yadayim. Why is it a good Netillas Yadayim? Because Rabbeinu Tam is looking at it and he's saying, where did this water come from? This water came from a keli. At the beginning of the Netillas Yadayim, you took a keli and you did a proper Netillas Yadayim from a keli onto your right hand. Now there's leftover keli water in the palm of your right hand, so you pour it over onto the left hand. So Rabbeinu Tam says that works because that's keli water. That is water that came from a keli. It went from a keli onto your first hand, and then you poured it onto the second hand, but it originated from a keli. So the Rabbeinu Tam says that that's okay with a very important caveat. And that caveat is that the water has to be tar. The water can't be water that's tamei. So let's take a look what the Machaber says. V'Rabbeinu Tam Mater Bezu. The Rabbeinu Tam says that in the second case of the Machaber, where you're pouring leftover water from your first hand onto your second hand, that is okay, and that does affect Netillas Yadayim. Why? Kevin Chetchilas Netila Liyadai Achas, because the Netillas Yadayim that you poured onto your first hand, Hayamin Akli. So this water originated from a keli. Since it originated from a keli, the Rabbeinu Tam said it's okay, with a caveat. Continues the Machaber, but that's only true if the first hand is tar. What does that mean that the first hand is tar? Says the Machaber, remember what we keep on saying. When you pour water from a keli onto your hand, the tumah goes off your hand and it goes into the water. Now, in that scenario, let's play this out. Let's say you wash the Netillas Yadayim on your first hand, but you use less than a revius of mayim. The tumah comes off your hand, it goes into the water. Now, if you're going to take that water and you're going to pour it onto your second hand, you can't do Netillas Yadayim. You're using water that's tamei. That can't work. So says the Rabbeinu Tam, what scenario does work? If you wash the Netillas Yadayim from a keli onto the first hand, using more than a revius of mayim. So we keep on saying, when you wash the Netillas Yadayim with more than a revius of mayim, the tumah goes puff. The tumah goes away. There's no more tumah. It's not even in the water. So in that case, Rabbeinu Tam says it's mutter to do Netillas Yadayim with the leftover water of the first hand onto the second hand. Why? Keli is not a problem because this water originated from a keli. Tum and tahara, it's not a problem because since you washed with more than a revius on the first hand, there's no tumah in the leftover water on your first hand. But if you washed with less than a revius, then that water is tameh, and you pour it onto your second hand, you're trying to affect the Netillas Yadayim with tameh water. Let's see this. So again, reading in the Mechaber, since the water originated from a keli, but it has to be that the first hand is completely tar. So, for example, you used a revius or more than a revius in one pour, so there's no tumah here at all. Says the Ramah, Hagah. The very interesting Ramah. The Ramah says that the minig seems to be makel like the Rabbeinu Tam. So technically you could do this. You could wash a proper Netillas Yadayim with more than a revius of mayim onto the first hand, then take the leftover water and pour Netillas Yadayim onto the second hand. Aval, but the Ramah says, the minig notwithstanding, aval asvara harishona hi ha'ikar. But he says that that's really not the ikar halacha. The ikar halacha is not like the minig. The ikar is like the first opinion brought down by the Mechaber, v'lachein yesh lahachmer lechatchila, and therefore lechatchila you certainly should be machmer. Now let's see a lot of what we spoke out inside in the Mishnah Beururah, ois katan lamed aleph. Again, the Rabbeinu Tam, and we're learning like the Mishnah Beururah right now, the Rabbeinu Tam said that in the second case of the Mechaber, that could be a good Netillas Yadayim. You washed a proper Netillas Yadayim on the first hand. Now you want to take the leftover water and pour it onto the second hand. Rabbeinu Tam said you could do that. But it has to be that the first hand and the water is completely tahar. For example, you washed with more than a revius. Explains the Mishnah Beururah. V'hu shahoisa demavur lekaman b'siman kuf samach beis, because it is explained clearly later on in Siman kuf samach beis sif beis through hey. Demayim harishonim sheshoivchen al yadai l'shem netila. The first pour of water that you pour onto your hands for the Netillas Yadayim, heim atzma nitma'u b'nigasan biyadav. That water itself becomes tameh when it touches your hand. V'im kain, and if so, you have tameh water here. V'im kain im yishpoich miyadachas al yadei hashniya. If you take that water from your first hand and try to pour it onto the second hand, lo yitar hoisa, it's not going to be matar the second hand. Kevin damayim atzman tmeimen, because you're trying to wash the Netillas Yadayim with water that's tameh. V'lachein, and therefore, Kosav, the Mechaber writes in the name of the Berurah Tam, that this only works shahoisa yadai harishona tahira, if the first hand and the water that's in it is completely tar. Sha'oz loy nitbu amayim sheshavach aleh. If we're dealing with complete tahara, then the water doesn't become tameh. And now he explains this. Ois katan lamed beis tahira. First, he makes a side point. Kasu achrayim, the achrayim write, Dal kalpanim lo hit the Rabbeinu Tam. The Rabbeinu Tam is not being matir, elarak lishpoich miyad zu lechaverta. He's making a very important tangential point, the Chavetz Chaim. When the Rabbeinu Tam says that you can take the water from the first hand and pour it onto the second hand, he's only being matir, pouring the water from the first hand to the second hand. But he would not be matir, taking the first hand while it's wet and touching the second hand, being mishafshef, rubbing the two hands together so that the first hand comes into contact with the second hand. Why not? Explains the Chavetz Chaim. The only thing the Rabbeinu Tam is being matir is to pour water from the first hand to the second. But not to either rub or even simply make contact between the first hand and the second hand. Because if you contact the second hand with the first hand, even if the first hand is completely tar, even if you washed Netillas Yadayim with more than a revius, so the first hand is tahar, the water in the first hand is tahar, even if you did that, yes, you could pour the water from the first hand to the second hand, but you can't touch the second hand. Because if you touch the second hand and your first hand is wet, so now everything is going to become tameh because of the second hand. So it's very nice that a second ago you had a first hand that was tar, but once you touch the second hand, it's tameh again. So could you pour water from the first to the second? Yes, but you can't make contact. So if you're going to make contact between the two hands, even though the first hand is tar, but it's going to become tameh by virtue of touching the second one. Okay, then the Mechaber said, what does it mean to have the first hand and the water in it completely tar? He said, for example, if you wash with more than a revius, or at least a revius, bebasachas, in one pour. Says the Mishnah Kat Lamed Gimel, a halacha that we've already mentioned many times. In such a case, when you wash with at least a revius of mayim in one pour, av shahoisa temeya, even though the hand was tameh, nitara yadai b'shvicha achas. The hand becomes completely tar with one pour. V'gam hamayim atzman loy nitmu, and the water of the Netillas Yadayim does not become tameh. It doesn't take the tumah from the hands. The revius b'vasachas, because when you wash with a revius in one pour, asua kemikva hamitaheres. The Chazal made that pour like a mikveh. When you go into a mikveh, we don't say that if you're tameh and you go into a mikveh, the tumah comes off of you and it goes into the water of the mikveh. If that was true, that another person that's tameh comes into the mikveh, he wouldn't become tar. All the tumah would have gone off of you and it would have gone into the water in a mikveh. That's not what happens. When you're tameh and you go into a mikveh, the tumah goes puff. The tumah's gone. Says the Chachamim, when you wash the Netillas Yadayim with at least a revius in one pour, the tumah goes puff. The tumah is gone. The tumah does not remain in the water. So v'gam hamayim atzman lo nitmu. The revius b'vasachas asua kemikva mitaheres. Shagam hamayim tahirim heim. Even the water is tar. It does not take over the tumah. K'lekamal mesimin kuf samach beis dalet. V'lachein, and therefore yachal lishbach b'mayim ela gufam. So now, if you wash the first hand with at least a revius, you could take that water. Mimayim elu gufam, from that very water, shenitzkabes l'soich pisas yadai, that collected in the palm of your hand, al yad hashniya, on the second hand. Miu zedafke im shafach haravias al yad karoi. But remember, this is only if you did a proper Netillas Yadayim. Not only did you do a revius, but you poured the revius onto your hand in the proper method for the Netillas Yadayim. Dahainu kedin netila al kolayad. You have to pour it over the entire hand. Mi bifnim, the inside of the hand. Umi bachutz, the outside of the hand. Dilu shafach kula rak l'sech pisas yadai. If what you did was you took a revius of mayim and you poured it into the palm of your hand, then even the first hand is not tar. Ein ze netila karoi. That's not a proper Netillas Yadayim. V'yadai arishana atzma tameya. Even the first hand is still tameh. V'gam hamayim nitmu ba, and the water would also be tameh. Ois katan lamed daled. The Rabbah said he ikar. The first opinion, the opinion of the Mechaber, not the Rabbeinu Tam, that this does not work. Even if your first hand is completely tar, you cannot pour the water from the first hand onto the second hand. It will not affect the Netillas Yadayim because it didn't come from a keli. So the Ramah said, he ikar. That's the ikar halacha. V'chein hu das shar paiskim deloik Rabbeinu Tam. And the rest of the paiskim also hold that way. They argue on the Rabbeinu Tam. Ois kat lamed hey. Therefore the Ramah said, certainly lechatchila we should be machmer. For Ashal, the Marshal, and the Yam Shloimer, Hichmer, Af b'di'evet. He's machmer, and he says even b'di'evet, this wouldn't make it a Netillas Yadayim. The Gam Ludas Ramah, and he says that even according to the Ramah, who dafka b'shasat chak, this would only be acceptable in a shasat chak where you don't have a keli. Avo b'nizdamnu loy mayim yital shenis ubeli bracha. But if you come across more water and maybe a keli, you should wash again without a bracha. Okay, let's go on to Siv Zayin. 2, 4, 5 lines off the top in the Mechaber Anun Amud Aleph. Says the Mechaber Siv Zayin. Very well known and a very important halacha, a very critical requirement in the Netillas Yadayim. Tzarich sheyavayu hamayim mikayach noisein. In the vernacular that most people are familiar with, the water for Netillas Yadayim has to come onto your hands mikayach gavra. It has to be poured by a person. The water has to come onto your hand through the action of a person. That pour has to come to you from a person's action. From the strength, from the energy provided by a person. Lefikach, you can tell I'm using a lot of words here because I'm trying to bring out the point as clear as I can. The point of mikayach hanoisein. And we could illustrate this with the case given here by the Mechaber. Lefikach, since we have this requirement that the water has to come to your hands mikayach hanoisein, lefikach, therefore, tzinor, a pipe, really means kind of like a half pipe. Shedoila mayim min hayaor, in a situation where you have like a long half pipe that's open on the top. And what people do is they take a bucket, they go to the river, they fill up a bucket, and then they pour the water from the bucket into this half pipe. What's the purpose of this half pipe? This half pipe allows the water to flow down to a field and irrigate a field. So maybe you have a pipe like this that's 100 feet long. And on one end, near one end is a river. Near the upper end of the pipe is a river. The pipe is pitched to go down to the field. So you go with a bucket to the river, you fill up the bucket, you pour it into this channel, into this half pipe, and then the water flows down the channel until finally it arrives at the field and it irrigates the field. Okay. What's this have to do with Netillas Yadayim? So explains the Mechaber. Lefika, tzinor, if you have this half pipe, shedoila mayim min hayaor, where you use a bucket to draw water from the river, v'shoifich bai, and then you pour the water into this tzinor, v'nimshachim mimenu hamayim, and the water flows through the tzinor, lahashkais hasadeh, to get to a field and irrigate a field. You cannot go ahead and dunk your hands into the flowing water in the tzinor, so that the water should flow over your hands, and you're trying to accomplish the Netillas Yadayim. So you've got your tuna sandwich, and you've got this tzinor, and the beautiful, nice, fresh, cold water is running and flowing down the tzinor. So you want to wash the Netillas Yadayim. You take your hands and you dunk them into the tzinor so that the water should flow over your hands. Does that work? Says the Mechaber, no, it does not work. Why? Because the water is not flowing over your hands mikayach adam. Now, it's true. An adam, a mensch, filled up the bucket. That's kayach adam. Then he took it and he poured it into the tzinor. So an adam poured the water into the tzinor. But now the water that's flowing down the tzinor, is the water that's flowing down the tzinor flowing mikayach adam? No, it's flowing down the tzinor mikayach gravity. It's flowing because of gravity. It's pitched. That's not mikayach adam. So the water is not flowing over your hands mikayach adam. And you need kayach adam. Therefore, says the Mechaber, in this case, this would not work. This would not affect Netillas Yadayim. Shekvar posak kayach hashoifech. You'll tell me, what do you mean? A mensch poured the water into the tzinor. Yes. But that kayach, the pour that the mensch did, that kayach is already gone. The fact that the water is flowing now is not because of his pour. Yes, the water originated in the tzinor because of his pour. Without his pour, there wouldn't be any mayim in the tzinor. But that's not what's making the tzinor flow. What's making the water in the tzinor flow is gravity. And that's not kayach adam. And in the words of the Mechaber, kfar posak kayach hashoifech. The kayach of the one who poured the water into the tzinor, that kayach is already gone. That energy is already used up. That put the water in the tzinor. But that's not making the water in the tzinor flow. But the Mechaber says, "Ve'imeisim yadav karav limkayim hashvicha." If you would dunk your water into the tzinor right next to where the guy pours the water in, then the Mechaber says, even if you didn't stick your hands right into the pour that was coming out of the bucket. No, the pour that came out of the bucket landed in the tziner. But you put your hands right at the top of the tziner, right at the beginning. That, the Mechaber says, is okay. Also like Netila. That is a good Netilas Yadayim. The Kol Zman Shein Kroivim L'Mkayim HaShvicha, as long as you're close to the point where the pour went into the tziner, Adayin Mikoychai Heim Boim. That's still called Mikoyach HaNoisein. Now, the Mechaber doesn't give you a share of what's called close and what's not called close, so we have to use our brains. So you have to look at the situation. You're going to go ask a Paisik Shaila, he's going to have to go look and see, okay, what does it look like? Is that called Koyach HaNoisein or is it not called Koyach HaNoisein? You need a fifth chelik of Shulchan Aruch also. Says the Mishnah is cut Lamed Vav. Shedoy Lamayim, you have the situation with the tziner where people draw water. Shedoy Lamayim means they draw water. It's Tzayim Lomar. What the Mechaber wants to say is, Shedoyla adamayim min hayaor, a person goes and draws water from the river, bidli, with a bucket, v'shoifech l'soich atzinar, and then he pours it into the pipe, sheyavayu mimenu l'sadais, so that it should flow down to the fields, to irrigate the fields. Ubazeh, and this person is coming, lead ten yadav l'soich atzinar, to dunk his water in his hands into the tzinar, rachaik mimakam sheshoifchen bai, further, far downstream, far away from the point where the water gets poured into the tziner, so that the water should flow over his hands, and he thinks that will be a good Netilas Yadayim. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is so careful with his words. And I cut in Lamed Vav in the Sharetzion, the Chavetz Chaim tells you why he wrote the last four words of this ice cotton. Why does he say v'soiver, and he thinks sheichashav loyal netila, that the Netilas Yadayim would be good? I mean, obviously, if he's dunking his water into his hands into the tzinar, he's doing it because he thinks that the Netilas Yadayim is going to be an effective Netilas Yadayim, right? That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to do Netilas Yadayim. Why does the Chavetz Chaim have to tell me? The reason he's doing this is because he thinks it's going to be good for Netilas Yadayim. Duh, why else is he doing it? There's a reason why the Chavetz Chaim says this. Take a look at Eis Kat Lamed Vav in the Sharetzion, because he's bavarning a different issue. And that is, do you need kavana from the Netilas Yadayim? Now over here, on one side, you don't have kavana. The person who filled up the bucket of water and poured it into the tzinar did not pour it into the tzinar for the purposes of the Netilas Yadayim. He poured it into the tzinar for the purposes of irrigation. So we definitely don't have kavanah for the Netilas Yadayim on the part of the noisein. But, says the Chavetz Chaim, you do have kavanah for the Netilas Yadayim on the part of the one who's doing the Netilas Yadayim, and that could be enough. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah weiter, the reason this is no good, Eis Katan Lamed Zayin. No. First, the Mechaber said this is no good because you put your hands into the tziner, 35 feet downstream from where the fellow with the bucket poured it into the tziner. There's no kayach hanoisein. There's no kayach gavra. The water didn't flow over your hands be kayach adam. It flew over your hands be kayach gravity. But if you do it very close to the point where the pour from the bucket into the tziner was made, then the Mechaber said it does work. Why? Because then then we say that the water is flowing over your hands because of the kayach of the noisein. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'afta Netilas Yadayim mikli hu dafka. Wait a second. You're dunking your hand into a tzinar from Netilas Yadayim? Haven't we been busy saying that you need a keli? So what kind of dunking your hand into a tzinar? How could that possibly work for Netilas Yadayim? Says the Mishnah Berurah, since now you're putting your hands, you're dunking your hands close to the point of the pour, sheshoifech bidli, where the water was poured in with a bucket is a keli, choshev mikayach hakli gamkein. So you hear what the Chavetz Chaim is saying. If you dunk your hands into the tzinar, very close to where the fellow poured the water from the bucket into the tzinar, you accomplish two things. First of all, you accomplish that's called mikayach adam. That's called that the water flowed over your hands. Mikayach, the adam who poured the water in. You also accomplish that you get the keli. Since the water over here originated from a keli, and you're that close to the pour of the keli, this constitutes water that came from a keli. Pashut, but it's pashut, says the Chavetz Chaim. Dem shafach l'soichat tzinar b'kli psula. Let's say the water was poured into the tzinar using a keli that is not usable for Netillas Yadayim. It's a keli that has a big hole in it, so it's not a keli that's kosher for Netillas Yadayim. In that case, kigoyim b'menukov, like a keli with a hole, then af b'noisid karv l'mekay b'shvicha. Then even if you stick your hands into the tzinar close to the point of the pour, puzzle is still puzzle. Deinam bar mikli, because now you don't have the advantage of a keli. The keli is a keli puzzle. And loy ba'ifin and Beururah kamei. Okay. Bottom line in the Mechaber, right by the Ois Kat and Lamad Ches for the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mechaber, V'imhit bil yadai l'soich hatzinar hazeh, einam tahirais mikayach tefila. Don't think that by dunking, you'll say like this, you're right, if I dunk my hand into the tzinar, I don't have kayach gavra, the water didn't flow over my hands, mikayach hanoisein. Also, maybe I don't have a kli, because I'm dunking, I'm not using a keli. But wait a second. Maybe I could be yoitza, the gzeira of Netillas Yadayim, through tvilas Yadayim. If you need to wash a tuna fish sandwich, and there's nothing available, no keli, no anything, but you're standing by a mikveh, you could dunk your hands into the mikveh. And that's tvilas Yadayim, that works. So why doesn't this work? I'll dunk my hand into the tzinar. Why doesn't that work? Says the Mechaber, no. By dunking your hands into the tzinar, einam tahiris mikayach tefila. Don't think you can accomplish tvilas yadayim. Mipnei shehem she'uvim. Why? Because the water in the tzinar is mayim she'uvim. It's drawn water. It's water that was put in a keli. And we know that a mikveh can't be mayim she'uvim. And the halach of tfilas kelim follows the rubric of the halach of tfilas haguf, of dunking yourself when you're tameh. It needs all the halachas of a mikveh, so it can't be mayim she'uvim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, is kat lam ches, v'im hipel yadai, hainu shetchavan b'mayim sheniskansu b'sechat tzinar. If you just dunk your hands into the water of the tzinar, u'ba la'achshiran mikayach tvila, and you want to say that now your hands should be tar because of tvilas yadayim, kabavur lekamei b'sif yodalid, because we're going to see later on in sif yodalid in this siman, the tvila dami mahani liyadayim kishetayvlan mamayina b'mikvah. We know that tvilas yadayim in a mikvah or in a spring, we know that works. Over here it doesn't work in the tzinar. Why? It's got lamites shem she'uvin, because that's mayim she'uvin. And mayim she'uvin is possible for a mikveh. Vein makshirin mikayach tvila. We only allow you to use tfilas yadayim, the mayim aksherim l'tfilas haguf, with water that would be kosher of mikveh water that you could use to be metar your whole body. V'al kaban b'sif tezayin the Ravid makshir b'she'uvim arbon sa b'karka. The Ravid says you could do tfilas yadayim even in mayim she'uvim if it's 40 saw together in the ground. However, many disagree with this. Okay? We're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time on the top of Nun Amud Beis by the words in the Mechaber Vahani Mili. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schos of limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. The Ran Shem should send Yeshua the first Panasat Shedduchim to all need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Koil Tzedek B'mehera V'yameinu Amen. Be well.